So good afternoon to everyone and welcome to today's virtual design review panel meeting. This is the first item on the agenda. I am Joe Bordeloni, Development Planning Technician, host of this meeting, but panel member David Calusio will be the chair. In addition to the panel members, we have the applicant team, city staff, members of the public, and the media observing this meeting. Members of the public are welcome to observe the meeting only, please. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded to the DRP webpage. Just a reminder to please keep your microphones muted if you're not speaking. Thank you, and David, please begin the meeting.
Thank you, Joe. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. Joe, can you please confirm that this session is being recorded?
It is, yep.
And are there any changes to the agenda today?
There are not, no.
Are there any panel members who have a conflict of interest with this applicant? I'm assuming silence means that there is no conflict. And then I'll turn it over to the panel, the planner, for a 10-minute presentation. The first item on the agenda today is the review of the urban design guidelines for the Waterdown Community Node Secondary Plan. The lead planner on the file is Melanie. I'm not sure, Pham. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Good afternoon, Melanie. We are ready for your presentation. Take it away.
Okay, can everyone hear me all right?
I can, okay. Yes.
Great, thanks. So good afternoon, members of the design review panel. I'm a senior planner with the city's community planning and GIS section. And today I'm going to be providing the staff background presentation for the Waterdown Community Node Urban Design Guidelines. And following my overview, Brooke McElroy will be presenting the guidelines. So the Waterdown Community Node Secondary Plan Study was initiated in late 2018. The intent of the study is to develop a long-term land use plan for the central area of Waterdown that will be directing how future change and growth should be managed. The study is comprised of three main parts: the secondary plan, the development of urban design guidelines, which will support the secondary plan, and a cultural heritage review, which will provide recommendations for conserving the area's heritage. The study area is identified as a community node in the city's urban structure within the Urban Hamilton Official Plan. It's generally bounded by Parkside Drive to the north, Grindstone Creek and First Road to the east, and generally extends west to Golden View Court and south down to the southern end of Main Street. Development of the draft guidelines that we're consulting on today started in November of 2019, where the City of Hamilton hosted a design workshop to get input on what the design of new development and public realm areas should look like in the Waterdown core. We had a good attendance at this workshop and a significant amount of input was received. And in October last year, we solicited feedback on the key directions, the structure and the character areas for the guidelines, which came out of the first workshop as well. And we've also had throughout the process input from several focus group meetings and from internal consultation with the city's technical advisory group, which has all been used to help develop the guidelines. The purpose of the guidelines is to provide guidance on the design of new buildings, sites, and the public realm. The key recommendations in the guidelines will also be translated into secondary plan policies. And these guidelines are intended to be a key tool for city staff to use to review and evaluate development proposals in this area. In addition to being a guiding document for new development, we will also be using them to inform our assessment of zoning updates that may be necessary to ensure consistency with the secondary plan and the design guidelines. As part of the study, the boundaries of the node have been further refined and form a smaller subset of the overall study area. So areas outside of this defined node, which is in the darker brown, are considered low-density residential neighborhoods. And within the node, there are a mix of uses, which include commercial uses, institutional uses, some residential uses, and also a large community park. The main arterials in the node are Hamilton Street, which runs north-south on this map, and Dundas Street, which runs east-west. The guidelines focus primarily on the node area, although some basic design guidance is provided for the residential neighborhoods, particularly because they are considered established historic neighborhoods and some areas are recognized as cultural heritage landscapes. There are many heritage resources in the area, including a designated heritage conservation district that overlaps with the study area, and it's shown in the purple. Here are a few images of the Hamilton Street context. Hamilton Street is an area with several large commercial plazas and generally larger and deeper lots than the rest of the node. Built form is typically located at the back of lots with large parking lots abutting the street. And boulevards are sodded with some tree plantings in this area. At the north end of Hamilton Street is Waterdown Memorial Park, which is a large community park. So here are a few images showing conditions on the segment of Dundas Street, which is west of Hamilton Street. Lot sizes and types of commercial development vary in this area. And on Dundas Street, east of Hamilton Street, built form is very different. As shown in the images here, the lot fabric is smaller and buildings are set close to the street. Many of the existing buildings in this portion of the node have heritage value. So shown here is a copy of the draft mapping from the land use plan. A low-rise built form is planned for the historic portion of the node east of Hamilton Street of a maximum height of 3 stories. And a low to mid-rise built form is planned for other portions of the node at a maximum of 6 to 8 stories. Pedestrian focus street policies, which require certain factors such as minimum 2-story building heights, set close to the street, and mandatory commercial on the ground floor, are proposed in this area outlined in purple. The secondary plan study is currently in its 3rd phase, so the review of these draft guidelines by the design review panel will be used to help us prepare a final version of the guidelines for council consideration in conjunction with the final draft of the secondary plan. And these are anticipated to be brought forward later this year in the fall. So thank you very much. That concludes my presentation, and I'd like to pass it over to Brooke McElroy now for their presentation on the guidelines.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tanisha Pahezin-Ochente, and I'm a planner and associate at Brooke McElroy. I'm joined by my colleague Nathan Flack, a senior associate and urban designer and architect. Our team has been retained by the City of Hamilton to produce the urban design guidelines for Waterdown. We know that you've had time to review the full draft urban design guideline document, so this presentation is just a brief overview of the key urban design elements. Next, please. The guidelines focus primarily on the part of the study area identified as the community node, which is a smaller subset of the secondary plan study area. The Waterdown Community Node Urban Design Guidelines promote high-quality urban design for buildings, sites, and the public realm. The draft guidelines and the guiding principles were informed by extensive community consultation and feedback. These guidelines include create a connected Waterdown, create animated streetscapes, create more efficient and compact development through intensification, protect neighborhoods, conserve and enhance natural and cultural heritage, and promote high-quality site and building design. Next, please. The vision for the Waterdown Community Node is premised on the establishment of 2 character areas, the Hamilton-Dundas character area and the historic commercial character area. The future form of these areas will reinforce the pedestrian-friendly nature of the historic village core and promote a compact urban development pattern within the community node, focusing density within the Hamilton-Dundas character area and ensuring consistency in streetscape design between the 2 areas. The decision for two character areas is informed by the existing character of each and the established development potential. Next, please. The Hamilton-Dundas character area will be the focus for intensification within the community node. Large lots will accommodate a gradient of heights and densities in mixed-use development. A maximum of 6 stories is permitted, and up to 8 stories on the west side of Hamilton Street in exceptional circumstances. High-quality design, materials, built form, and public realm design will complement the adjacent historic commercial area. Built form should define the street edge with a 2 to 3 story street wall and step backs above. And streets should be designed to accommodate pedestrians, cyclists, transit, and vehicles.
So within the Hamilton-Dundas character area, establishing a gradient of heights and densities will help us to achieve a goal of buffering and transitioning between existing low-rise single detached homes and more intensive development. It'll be achieved by encouraging a range of building types from semi-detached and duplexes to townhouses, stacked townhouses, as well as mixed-use commercial and residential mid-rise buildings. So the taller buildings, this section here is taken east-west through Hamilton Street, looking at the intensity really being focused on the east and west sides of Hamilton Street, and then decreasing to both the east and west sides towards the existing neighborhoods. A number of new public streets within the large commercial lots will also help with that transition. This is an example lot development plan, which shows hypothetically one possible development scenario for a large commercial lot, like in this case, the Sobeys lot, which fronts both Hamilton Street and Dundas Street, and how it could evolve over time from single-use retail into a mixed-use residential and commercial site. So the purpose of these maps is to really apply the principles of the guidelines in an example scenario. So in this plan, you see that number one, all buildings are oriented toward the street with street presence and entrances directly on the street. The ground floors of residential units do have their own entrances and presence on the street as well as ground-oriented units. Parking is located at the interior of the lot and not fronting onto the main streets. New streets, a new street network really create a regular grid of walkable block sizes, which right now are not achieved in the larger blocks. New green spaces are introduced as part of those developments, publicly accessible green spaces. Transit stops are integrated into the street design on both Hamilton and Dundas streets. Access into existing parks and open spaces is emphasized with direct pedestrian links. And then access to parking is from the interior new street network and doesn't cause conflicts along the main Hamilton or Dundas streets. So we can really reduce the excessive number of existing curb cuts. You can see the number of them existing right now on both of those streets. Introducing new pedestrian crossings, for example, across Hamilton Street, where there currently are not crossings for several hundred meters, and introducing that for easy access on both sides. And then finally, introducing tree plantings along all of the street frontages, the rear yards, the parking areas, and open spaces. There's a distinct difference between the existing residential areas and the larger commercial lots where we see very little tree coverage. So improving that over time will be important. Currently, as Melanie mentioned, the large setbacks and the parking frontages with frequent curb cuts and a lack of bike lanes really make Hamilton Street quite unfriendly for pedestrians and cyclists. And in the future, by reconfiguring these streets, we can ensure that there are plenty of not only large trees and wide sidewalks and safe crossings, but we can integrate the transit stops into the streetscape, as well as dedicated cycle tracks that are fully separated from traffic. We have a very wide right-of-way. We've got nearly 30 meters on portions of Hamilton Street where we can achieve all of these things with a wide planted green boulevard for more planting as well. Now switching to the commercial historic character area, here we're looking to maintain, as Melanie mentioned, the small lots and the small scale commercial village character. This is achieved with 2 to 3 story building heights and a rhythm of narrow commercial frontages, a regular rhythm that is established already. Infill buildings should be low rise in form and start to really define that street edge. And this is already an area with heavy pedestrian use, and we want to enhance the public realm and the streetscape further to support that walkability and the sense of place that's there. And then finally, we want to ensure that new development integrates new connections between urban spaces, so contributing positively to the overall public realm. Here's an example lot development plan, which shows some hypothetical future development scenarios within the historic commercial character area. The intent here is to fill in the missing teeth, which in a lot of cases are parking frontages on the streets, with very thoughtfully designed buildings and open spaces, all of which reinforce the character area and the sense of place in the downtown. So many of the principles that we saw in the Hamilton-Dundas character area also apply here. These include street orientation for all of the new buildings, parking located at the lot interiors, creating both public green space as well as hard and soft-scaped open space within the lots. This is a very urban area, and we see potential for a good mix of hard and soft-scaping in those open spaces. Re-envisioning Franklin Street, which runs north-south, as a pedestrian-focused shared street with unique paving patterns and infrastructure to be able to occasionally close that street to traffic for certain events. Designating Barton Street, which runs east-west with a small jog, as the cycling route, which will get the bikes off of Dundas Street, which is the designated truck route. We heard a lot of concerns about safety along Dundas Street, so creating a convenient secondary cycling network off of Dundas will be important. And appropriately, appropriately transitioning from heritage properties with perhaps larger setbacks to our ideal close setback with the street edge will be important to maintain the prominence in the streetscape of those heritage resources while also creating a positive street interface with the sidewalk. And then finally, like the other area, planting trees along all frontages in yards, parking areas, and open spaces to really increase the amount of tree cover overall in this area. Now, this plan assumes that most of the underutilized lots are potential development sites, but obviously further heritage studies would be required for any lots that may possess cultural heritage value but have not been listed or designated yet. This is a view of Dundas Street looking west. Both the old and recent developed buildings in this historic commercial area have a positive relationship with the street, with interesting retail frontages and entrances next on the sidewalk. Our vision for this area is to really continue that, and we see a real enhancement of the streetscape to provide very generous wide sidewalks, safe crossings. We see new tree planting, attractive, unique sidewalk paving with new furnishings, benches, lighting, and new, as we mentioned, new low-scale up to 3-story buildings that start to fill in those missing teeth, the gaps along the edge of the street to really start creating a consistent edge. These buildings will be animated with active retail, restaurants, cafes, other businesses along the ground floor that will spill out into the generous public realm to make for a really exciting and interesting pedestrian experience year-round. The intent is that this new enhanced streetscape and the pedestrian-friendly scale and character will continue from that historic commercial area toward Hamilton Street and turning north on Hamilton Street to really create that sense of unity in terms of the look and feel of the streetscape within the overall Waterdown community node.
The guidelines recognize that some incremental change can happen in the neighborhoods over time and encourage compatibility of fit within the neighborhoods to reflect existing design character. But we want to note that the neighborhoods will remain stable but not static. So additions, renovations, and rebuilds on residential properties may occur over time, which we recognize in the guidelines, in particular large institutional sites which have a greater potential for intensification. But again, the scale, form, height of new development should complement the neighborhood's prevailing design character, and future development should not erode existing character or function. Within the guidelines, we include a few diagrams demonstrating best practices for neighborhood design for new single detached development that allow for contextual fit within the neighborhoods and demonstrate some of the guidelines that we've identified in the document. This example shows a rear front facing garage scenario. So showing new development fitting within the existing street pattern of front or rear garages and driveways. And ideally that the driveway would straddle 2 lots, but it could be located on 1 lot if shared access is not feasible. This example shows the front garage scenario for a new single detached development. Again, an existing street pattern of front garages and driveways, but where possible, we want to limit non-permeable driveway areas and encourage green permeable areas within the design of driveways. It's our hope that the guidelines for the community node will help to build on the strong character of Waterdown and accommodate growth and development in a responsible and sustainable way. That concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. We'll now open the floor to any questions or comments.
David, I think you're speaking. I think we're not hearing you. You might be muted.
That would be why
There we
nobody's
go.
talking. Sorry about that. Jana, do you have any questions?
Yes, just 2 questions. I was wondering, maybe the first one is more for the city staff. Are any of the new streets and linkages which are shown on the demonstration plans and Franklin Street, for example, being a pedestrian street, is any of this secured in any way, or is it just suggested at this time through this document?
So if I can answer that, the Franklin Street was identified by the public and by city staff. It's an existing road, but it was identified as a potential road where we could make some design changes. Sometimes it is closed down for events, and that was sort of the thinking behind it, is that we would design it so that it could be set up that way as a pedestrian-friendly area that could be used for activities of that nature. In the other areas, such as the big Sobeys Plaza, there are no plans for roads at this time. So we're looking at if there's a major redevelopment to try and introduce those new roads, either as public streets or private roads within those big blocks.
Okay, thank you. And I assume, because you did mention residents, so there were meetings with the community, and my question basically were those meetings about what is actually valued the most as the essence, which you are asking about in your question. So what creates the character for this community, was that ever discussed?
I think, and Nathan, you can interrupt if you have something else to add, but I think what we heard the most from the public was about the village character. So there was a desire to see that village character maintained within the historic core and also carried forward further onto Hamilton Street, because that's a very different condition right now.
Okay, thank you.
Oda.
Hi, thank you for the presentation and for the guideline. It looks really nice. I had a question about to improving the pedestrian connections and the cycling paths. Has been considered the attractions out of the study zone. For example, the waterfall and the Bruce Trail and other attractions, for example, who attract the cyclists. So have it been considered, or is it on the plan for future?
Yes, so there is another study that's being completed concurrently with this, which is also we're aligning some of our secondary plan policies, and Nathan has also incorporated some of it into the guidelines. There's a transportation management plan that's being done for the whole area of Waterdown, so a much bigger area than just the node. But the cycling path additions and changes, and there are new connections over Grindstone Creek that were identified through that study. One that connects to the Smoky Hollow waterfall as well. So those are being dealt with through the transportation management plan, as well as certain of the pedestrian crossings that have been identified in certain areas that Nathan also mentioned. So we will be looking at doing implementation of those things through that process. But Nathan's and Tanisha's guidelines are providing a little bit of direction for how that should be designed.
Thank you.
Joey.
Thanks, David. I have one question. I was wondering what the rationale was for the historic commercial character area boundary, because it is different from the original HCD boundary.
Yes, so that it was kind of evolving through the public consultation process. We actually began with 3 different character areas based on kind of looking at overall lot sizes and development potential and just kind of overall look and feel. So the original areas were kind of the northern portion of Hamilton Street north of Dundas, and then that cluster around the intersection and to the west, and then the historic area. So the historic area was always a bit unique in itself because it's much smaller lot sizes. There's a real concentration of heritage buildings throughout. And there's just a sense of walkability that's very different in terms of the sidewalk, the relationship to the street. So over time, we actually kind of through consultations realized that those first 2 character areas concentrated on either side of Dundas around Hamilton were actually very similar in terms of recent development and streetscape. And that one unique piece was the historic commercial area. So that's where they separated. The actual separation line between the 2 is really based on the lot sizes and the patterns, where you start getting from the larger commercial lots down into the historic kind of standard lot pattern. And that's where that division happens.
Okay, thanks, Nathan.
Ada.
Thank you. It was a great presentation. My questions have already been answered and asked. Thanks.
Ted.
Thanks. I'm gonna maybe ask a redundant question, but I'm just, and I ask because I'm struggling a bit on how to respond to what we're seeing, and I'm just trying to understand how a master plan or a kind of larger vision is guiding all of this. It feels like we're seeing the kind of chapter 3, and it, chapter 1 is about here's the big vision for this location, and then chapter 2 might be here's how the infrastructure and the park systems tie together, and here's where the nodes are, and then the third one is like here's the character of those spaces. So am I reading that correctly? And what's coming and what aren't we seeing that is really the kind of missing link, at least for me?
For sure, yeah, and I think that's trying to keep to a 10-minute presentation and give you kind of the meat of the design component was our intention. As far as the document goes, there's the upfront sections really start to look into the history and what we found through the consultation process of what's important and what we wanted to really look at in terms of how we see this future vision happening. It moves from that kind of historical look into what the overall vision was based on the consultations that we had, and then moves into the specific guidelines. Now, what you're seeing in terms of this kind of master development plan is really just an effective tool that we find, which is an example of taking all of those guidelines and applying some of them to a site to give kind of a visual understanding of how that lands. It's difficult when we just have this kind of book of guidelines that can be read individually, understanding what that really means for visualizing how it comes down on the ground in future development. So what you're seeing in this presentation looks like a finished kind of master plan of what can happen. It's really just an example, the same way we would do a demonstration plan within a citywide guidelines document to show the application of the guidelines. So the way that the document is laid out, we hope kind of walks through all the way from the history through the consultation process down to what those guidelines and the application. So we're hoping that that kind of ties all of those pieces together.
Thank you.
Jennifer?
I have a little question, but I think it is coming out of Ted's bigger question. You talk about truck traffic along Dundas Street and a transportation management plan. So, and I don't want to get into the weeds of my comments, but I guess I am. Do we have to take that truck route as a established, agreed upon norm? Because it seems counterintuitive to what the heritage character enhancement is trying to get at.
So I'll let Melanie expand just on the city's side. In terms of our process, we've been working with the transportation group and kind of going back and forth and trying to find that ideal balance between what we know are kind of givens of realities in transportation. And we're also aware that there will be large changes over the 10 to 20 year horizon with new interchanges and bypasses happening. So this is really the kind of vision for the next 10 years, given the existing situation and truck route, to try to find that ideal balance. We're also hopeful that once the transportation master plan is complete and we find out where the future patterns are going to happen, we'll be really able to visualize a future Dundas Street that is entirely pedestrian friendly. So it's kind of an interim condition until that can happen. And we heard from the public that that was a big concern. And so everyone is hopeful that that pattern will change over time.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nathan. I don't have too much to add, except that it is a truck route right now. The truck route master plan is reviewed approximately every 10 years. We have just gone through that review just last year and this year, I believe. And because there aren't many alternatives, that route has to remain for the time being. But as Nathan mentioned, there are a number of other projects going on in Waterdown, including a new east-west arterial that's commonly referred to as a bypass road. And there's some other improvements to Waterdown Road and other areas going on. So in the future, there may be an opportunity to change that. And we did hear that from the public that was a desire for us to look at that. But as Nathan said, this is an interim condition for now and likely will be for the next 10 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
So if nobody has any other questions, I have had my questions answered as well. Thanks very much for your presentation. And at this time, I'll be giving each panel member an opportunity to comment on your work. So the first person is Jana, if I could ask you to provide comments.
Thank you, David. And thank you for the presentation. I think in response to the staff's questions, I think the essence of an area is always very tricky to describe and capture, and it often means very different things to different people. So I think that the character will always slightly change with any new development. That's inevitable. I'm not sure if it's clear at this time what are those attributes of that village character, other than the historic buildings and the natural heritage. That said, in my opinion, the guidelines are providing some good language for the future developers and for the staff in regard to the compatibility and complementary design. In some way, in also in regard to improvements to the public realm and somewhat to pedestrian connectivity, for example. I think a lot of good written direction is used, although I would strongly suggest to avoid wording such as encouraged and discouraged, and my experience that wording is not helpful at all. I strongly believe that more illustrations should be added to provide to clarify the intent of these guidelines. There are good street sections. There are also great diagrams demonstrating potential future development scenarios, but they're only for one block in each area. And I would recommend that you do a clear demonstration for the whole area with all the linkages and connections and possible also in 3D that could test your guidelines and you could look at the modeling from the street level point of view and see if what you are trying to achieve is actually feasible with these guidelines. Also, many written guidelines could use more illustration and better graphics, and actually more, because we are not using a lot of graphics or photographs to demonstrate the intent. There is one minor issue. There is a rear angular plane and setback recommendations for the Hamilton-Dundas character area. I don't know if you are trying to promote a 3-story form, but as you set it up, the 3-story form would only need a 7.5 meter setback, but a 4-story form, you need to combine this with angular plane from the property line. So that means that you are only allowing for 2 stories before you need to step the building back. So I'm not sure that's intention, but it's a small inconsistency, I think. The last comment I have is in regard to the second question: what are additional considerations to promote a unified character in terms of public realm? I think on page 29, I would just add paving to the consistent palette of public realms elements. I think you are listing a lot of them, and if it all works out, I think that could unify the public realm even better. I think that's all for me at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. Hoda.
Again, thank you for all the effort that you had in this presentation and guideline. I believe it has covered most of the details that is needed for especially landscape and streetscape. I would like just, I prefer to see more details about the active transport. And the more, as Jana said, more illustrations, some suggestions about the protected bus stops and pedestrian connection, and how the pedestrian connections and bicycle paths will work together. That's the thing that I would like to see more, and that would be so helpful to have illustration for those. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So for me, my focus is more on the historic area. I think highlighting the importance of the historic commercial character area out of a public process is important. I think it's important because it's good to see that these types of subjective, because they are subjective boundaries, can be developed from a broader perspective. And typically, it doesn't come from the public. So I think that's really nice to see. And I think this comment may be more for staff. The current HCD boundary is almost like the 90 degrees oriented from the commercial character area boundary. And I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to revise the current Heritage Conservation District boundary, if that can be reassessed and potentially expanded to include the applicant's assessment. I think this expanded boundary will provide further protection to preserve the heritage intactness of this part of the neighborhood, and also kind of support the identified community nodes that's come out of this report. And also assist, obviously assist in ensuring the right type of development happens in the area. Also, I think that noting that compatibility of new development with heritage resources and the guidelines that are recommended are strong and important. And of course, as developments come forward, more detail will be required that will come from city staff. Proposing to extend quality materials to the Hamilton Dundas area, I think is important to blend and complement the historic area. The example lot developments, I think, are pretty good, but I find that the approaches are too similar. And the heritage area has a very kind of distinct quality, very different to the Hamilton Dundas area. And I'm wondering if maybe there's more priority, and I think this was noted by Nathan. You said that the distinction between the areas came about by size of lots. That was one of the kind of major reasons for the distinction. I'm wondering if, because the historic area has smaller lots, that maybe there's an opportunity there to prioritize the pedestrian. And one way could be potentially to discourage property surface parking. So the Hamilton Dundas area has sort of room for hidden surface parking, which I think is fine and needed. But the historic area, maybe that can be eliminated, and maybe those interiors could have more of a focus on the public realm. That's all for me.
Thanks, John. Dana.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm really looking forward to see how this document plays with the official plan, but also the transportation master plan that you mentioned, to kind of really paint a fulsome picture of urban design. I have two kind of primary comments. My first is, you speak a lot to protecting established neighborhoods, and I think that's fine. However, I'd like to see that balanced with perhaps guidelines or strategies around equity, diversity, inclusivity. What you can do to really bring that in. I noticed one of the photos that you used had a bench with a dividing line, or what would be considered hostile architecture. So just thinking about that to truly bring kind of that level and that lens of urban design into the document. So it's not just focused strictly on protecting neighborhoods and on conserving heritage and other also important objectives. My second comment was around page 62, the angular plane at 4 stories. My thought is that around step backs at 4 stories, 5 stories, 6 stories can be very difficult to achieve. If you want to really ensure that you get these kind of low-rise buildings, it might be good to look at maybe options without those step backs. Otherwise, that could frustrate your ability to get buildings in that range, and then, you know, developers might just want to go taller, especially to make up the floor area lost by step backs. I've also done some reading recently on environmental efficiency step backs, or the ability to even produce them depending on how big the building is. So that's just something to look at around angular plane and to be cautious of. I know it can maybe be easier to absorb in a building that's 10, 12 stories, but maybe a bit challenging in one that is 4 stories to 6 stories, depending on the depth of the lot and the size of the building. Thanks.
Sorry, Ted.
Great, thanks. Thanks for your presentation. I might be repeating myself a little bit, but I guess what I'm really looking for to respond to in terms of how successful the guidelines are is this strong vision from the outset. What is Waterdown in 20, 30 years? And I'll caveat all this by saying I've only been there in Google Maps, so, you know, take it for what it's worth. But it feels like there's a kind of higher order, kind of powerful and bold vision for this place that needs to drive all of this. And I think then, you know, the streets planning, the cycle paths, the transportation management plan, the green infrastructure, the parks connections are going to start to tell the story of the pattern of development and how you kind of tie into that. So I find it a little difficult to respond to some of the information here, because I'm looking for where is this going, and how does this help you get to that, like, you know, far off place. In terms of the you know, we're seeing the diversion of biking paths and the conversations around truck paths. You know, these really don't, they don't, there's a cognitive dissonance with the idea of a village character when, you know, you're accommodating the truck transportation paths and diverting cyclists. And I know that that's maybe a short-term thing, but I think maybe starting with the long-term vision is a better place to be so that people can see that. I feel like the village character, and the information provided around that is effective, and I would support what Jana is saying is, can we see more illustrations? Can we see more examples and imagery and descriptions of what it is in that imagery that is, you know, achieving the goals that are being set out? And probably not within your scope, but, you know, doing an entire plan for that district would be, I think, really, really helpful. The Hamilton Dundas character, I feel the challenges of, you know, the village character has a lot of character. The Hamilton Dundas maybe not so much. And if the character doesn't exist, do we then seek it out in best practice elsewhere around the world? And do we really want to see, you know, here's what other places like your community have done along these arterials, and you know, here are a few examples of things that should be considered as best practice to develop towards. So that's a suggestion. Can the historic district be extended to the intersection of Hamilton and Dundas? Why limit that district to where it exists? Like, if that's the character of the village, let's take it to the most important, I'm assuming the most important node within the community. That to me is the future of the success of this entire community, is what happens in that shopping plaza. How does it become a node that draws you from that character, that pedestrian space, you know, to Hamilton? And conversely, on the other end, there's this kind of natural bridge and the I think it's called Grindstone Creek, which also looks like a railroad track. But it seems to me that there's another node that kind of is bookending that character district. And how does a conversation about engaging with that bridge and the natural part, and is there a park that should be there at the end of that street that connects you with the escarpment in some way or form? Two gas stations on your big corner, like should there be some language around, let's not have gas stations on the two big corners anymore, because I see them staying in some of the imagery. And I guess my last comment back to that shopping plaza at the main node is, should that have greater density? Should it be an aspirational area that, you know, has a really strong vision? You know, I'm thinking of like the shops at Don Mills, or some form that really is kind of creating some space that's unified. And should that be described as a kind of larger concept that needs to happen at some point? So those are my comments. So thanks.
Thanks, Ted. Jennifer.
Building on a lot of comments that have already been said, I think the essence of Waterdown, that heritage character area is of high value. So it would be nice if the guidelines pushed it to retain it and enhance it even a little bit more. Pulling the bikes away from that seems like a too bad that we have to deal with this as an interim solution. Just tiny case in point, a detail, it seems that the sidewalk width along the heritage character area varies because of traffic patterns. But what if the guidelines pushed it and said, no, we're going to make a consistent sidewalk edge so that we make a really consistent pedestrian pathway, and we make that commitment now, just to look forward to the future of maybe getting those trucks out of there and pulling the bike activity back. I appreciate the tools that are in the guidelines for the development of the Hamilton Street corridor. That'll only be an improvement to what's going on there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer. Not sure I have that much to add to what's been covered. I mean, I think that what Ted was commenting on, I share similar challenges in terms of commenting on. It was interesting, Nathan, when you described the vision, or in response to Ted's question about vision, you focused on the feedback that you got from the community. And I do wonder whether, if that is where the vision is coming from, whether it is inherently going to be limited to a more modest development potential than it could be, and it's implied in maybe some of Ted's comments that a more wide-ranging possibilities of what might be the right future vision might come out of that, and the higher density might support a more fulsome public realm and you know, development where the parking is not at grade and not above grade for inside buildings at grade that we are seeing elsewhere. So I think that I think the rest of the comments are I agree with. I think that the expansion of the illustrations, I thought in many ways your explanation today was better than the explanation of the guide, because you had focused in and explained a few of the points that you were achieving with a little bit more detailed focus that is only a tiny little button in the document. So I do think that that would be helpful. There is, and this is a very granular comment, I mean, you have a strategy identified, and this goes to just more illustrations. Again, you have a strategy identified for how to build within a new building within the Heritage Common areas there, the infill, and you talk about not mimicking the heritage building typology, which I think is a reasonable strategy, and you have an illustration for that, but only one. And then later in the building, you do have, later in the book, you have an illustration of a example within the community where I would say it actually is essentially a mimic of the heritage style. And I think that the fact that they're kind of equally weighted within the document is maybe would be counterbalanced if there were more illustrations of exactly what the intention is in terms of a modern but complementary insertion within that context, because I'm not sure that everybody really understands what you mean when you say that, and so I think you have to lead the audience to that conclusion. I think a lot of people in the community might actually look at the other one and say, yeah, that historicist kind of Walt Disney community is really what we want. And so I think you have to help educate as part of that guideline. I think that's the purpose of the guideline, is to communicate this future vision. And so I think that would be helped. And I think the possibility, and maybe a lot of what we're asking for is not part of this guide, but part of this larger exploration of where the community wants to go. Maybe there's another document that is delivering these visionary opportunities, and it's not really part of your mandate to deliver that, but I guess that's what we're kind of looking for. Anyway, thank you very much. I don't know if you have any questions for the panel. Welcome that. If there's anything unclear about the commentary that's been given to you.
I think the comments are extremely clear and really helpful in every case. I think we've got a lot to take back and discuss and think about. So we really appreciate all the comments.
Okay, well, if that's everything, I think I'll close the question and answer, and thank you very much again for an excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I think we're done.
Yeah, I think we're okay to wrap up now. So thanks again, everyone, for attending, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you
very much.
Yeah.